It started like one of those ordinary mornings in the quiet suburbs of Maplewood Heights, the kind where birds chirped, sprinklers hissed, and neighbors waved politely without ever really knowing each other. The kind of place where appearances mattered more than truth, where people smiled through fences but whispered behind curtains. That morning, the air smelled of fresh-cut grass and morning coffee as a delivery van pulled up to the corner of Cedar Lane. The driver's name was Derek Collins, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 30s with warm brown skin, tired eyes, and a quiet kind of grace. He wasn't new to hard work. He'd been grinding for years, juggling 2 jobs, building something real for himself, a life he could finally call his own. But to some people, men like Derek never seemed to fit the picture. He parked neatly in front of a large 2-story house. White panels, blue shutters, manicured lawn. The kind of house that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. He smiled faintly as he stepped out, holding a clipboard in one hand and a small box in the other. The address matched perfectly. This was it, the house he had just closed on last week. He hadn't moved in yet. The paperwork was done, but his official move-in date was tomorrow. Today, he was dropping off the last signed documents that had been mailed to his delivery company by mistake. It was supposed to be simple. Park, walk up, leave the envelope, drive off. But nothing about that morning would be simple. Because standing across the street, holding a tiny dog and a phone in her hand, was Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed neighborhood watch, queen of gossip, and the kind of woman who believed every smile she gave was a badge of moral superiority. She had seen Derek's van pull up, and immediately, something twisted in her chest. She didn't see a homeowner. She didn't see a man finalizing his dream. She saw what she wanted to see, a stranger in her perfect world. From her porch, she squinted and whispered under her breath, "Not in this neighborhood." Derek noticed her, gave a polite nod, the kind you give to a stranger to say everything's fine. But Karen didn't nod back. She froze, watching him with suspicion written all over her face. As Derek stepped onto the porch of his own house, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. He rang the doorbell just to test it. The sound echoed faintly through the empty house. He smiled again. Soon, this would be home. But then, from behind him, a sharp voice cut through the quiet morning. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Derek turned around. Karen was marching across the street, her dog yapping, phone still clutched in her hand. Her tone dripped with accusation, not curiosity. "Morning, ma'am," he said calmly. "Just dropping something off." She folded her arms. "You don't belong here. I know the people who live in this house, and they're not you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Not because he hadn't heard that tone before. He had. Too many times. But because this time, it was directed at something he owned. "Actually," Derek replied, keeping his voice level, "I do live here. Well, soon. Just closed on it last week." Karen scoffed. "Oh, please. Don't lie to me. I've lived on this street for 15 years. The Johnsons just moved out. The new owners haven't even arrived yet." "I know," Derek said quietly. "That's me." But she wasn't listening. She was already on the phone. "Yes, hello," she said, turning away from him, her voice rising. "There's a suspicious man at 1427 Cedar Lane. He's trying to break in." "Yes, right now. Please hurry." Derek exhaled slowly, his heart sinking. He tried to stay calm, tried not to let anger or fear take over. He'd dealt with assumptions before, in stores, on sidewalks, in lobbies where people asked if he worked here. But this was his property. His name was on the deed. And still, it wasn't enough. He reached into his pocket for his phone, not to call anyone, but to record. Not because he wanted a confrontation, but because he knew how these things could go. Karen stood on the edge of the driveway, phone still to her ear, glaring as though her suspicion was righteousness itself. "Ma'am," Derek said gently, "I don't want trouble. I can show you my ID." She took a step back. "Don't come near me." "I'm not," he began, but she cut him off. "I said stay back. I've called the police. They'll be here any minute." For a moment, Derek looked around, at the neighbors who had started to peek through blinds and doorways. He saw the curiosity, the judgment, the quiet amusement of people who didn't know what was happening but assumed he must have done something wrong. He wanted to yell, to shout the truth until they all heard it. But he didn't. He just stood there, still, calm, and tired of explaining his existence. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up. Sirens off, but lights flashing. The officers stepped out, hands near their holsters, scanning the scene. Karen immediately ran toward them, her voice trembling with false fear. "That's him," she cried. "He was trying to break into that house." Derek raised his hands slightly, palms open. "Officers," he said evenly. "I can explain." "Sir, step away from the porch," one of them ordered. He obeyed. Slowly. "This your van?" the officer asked. "Yes, sir. Delivery van. I work for Parcel Pro. Got ID on you?" "Of course." He handed over his license and work badge. The officer glanced at them, then at the house. "And what are you doing here?" "Delivering a document. It's actually my house. I just bought it." The officers exchanged looks. Karen gasped dramatically. "That's not true. He's lying. I told you. The new owners aren't moving in yet." Derek stayed silent, watching them scroll on their tablets as they ran his information. His heart thudded, but his eyes stayed steady. He'd learned that sometimes dignity was the only shield a man could carry. One officer walked up to him. "You said you own the property?" "Yes, sir." "What's your name again?" "Derek Collins." The officer nodded, typed something into his system, and within seconds, the truth flashed across the screen. The deed was under Derek's name. The sale was finalized. The officer looked up slowly. Then he turned toward Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his tone changing. "This man isn't trespassing. He's the legal owner of the house." Karen blinked, confusion and disbelief flooding her face. "What? No, that can't be right." "It's right," the officer interrupted. "The property transferred to Mr. Collins last week." The silence that followed was heavy. Neighbors watched from their porches, stunned. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Derek didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just looked at her with quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of being misjudged. Karen stammered. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, you could have just asked before calling the police. This could have gone differently." She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean any harm." But harm had already been done. After the police left, Derek stood for a long time in front of the house. The morning sun hit the porch just right, making the windows glow faintly. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of his life, the day he visited his new home. But instead, it became another reminder that for some people, proof wasn't enough. He looked down at the document he came to deliver, the final closing notice confirming his ownership, and smiled bitterly. The irony wasn't lost on him. Later that afternoon, when the neighborhood calmed down, Derek's realtor, Tina Alvarez, stopped by to drop off the keys. She was a middle-aged Latino woman with kind eyes and a fire in her voice. "You okay?" she asked as she handed him the keys. "Yeah," Derek said softly. "Had a little misunderstanding with one of the neighbors." "I heard," she said with a sigh. "Karen Whitmore, right?" He nodded. "She's been a problem for years," Tina muttered. "Always got something to say about who belongs where." Derek chuckled lightly. "Guess I'll have to introduce myself properly." And he did, just not in the way anyone expected. The next weekend, Derek moved in. Slowly but surely, he unpacked his boxes, painted the walls, planted a small flower bed out front. He didn't hide. He waved at every neighbor who passed, smiled, and kept going. He wanted peace, not pity. But Karen couldn't leave it alone. For weeks, she avoided looking at him directly, yet she always seemed to be watching. Every time his friends came by to help, she scribbled notes. When his sister dropped off groceries, Karen stood behind her curtain. One evening, Derek was setting up his mailbox when he noticed Karen's husband, Tom, walking by. Tom was quieter, older, tired, the kind of man whose eyes said more than his mouth ever did. He hesitated before speaking. "Hey," Tom said awkwardly. "Listen, about what happened the other day, my wife gets nervous sometimes. It's not personal." Derek looked at him calmly. "Maybe not to her, but it is to me." Tom nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. "You're right." There was silence for a moment. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said finally, before walking off. Over the next few months, things began to change. Derek became a familiar face. He volunteered at the local youth center, helped fix the community park benches. The kids loved him, especially when he brought his little niece over to play. Even the same neighbors who once stared at him began to wave genuinely. But Karen? She kept her distance, trapped between guilt and pride. Until one summer afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. The driver stepped out, young, black, mid-20s, carrying a package. Derek was mowing his lawn across the street when he saw Karen open her door. At first, everything seemed fine. But then, as the driver bent down to place the box, Karen's voice carried across the street again. Sharp, defensive, accusing. "Hey, what are you doing? Don't touch that." Derek froze, watching history threaten to repeat itself. The young man straightened up, confused. "Ma'am, I'm just dropping off your package." Karen's tone grew harsher. "I didn't order anything. Put it down and leave." He tried to explain, but she stepped back and reached for her phone again. That's when Derek walked across the street. Calm, deliberate, steady. "Afternoon, Karen," he said. She jumped, startled. "Oh, Derek, I didn't see you there. I think you might be about to make another phone call you don't need to make," he said quietly. Her face flushed. No, I just..." He looked, "Well, like me?" Derek asked, his tone still even. The silence that followed was brutal. Karen looked down, her voice faltering. "I didn't mean..." "I know," he said. "You never do." He turned to the young driver. "You're good, man. She's just a little jumpy." The driver nodded gratefully, left the package, and walked off. Karen stood frozen, guilt spreading across her face. Derek turned to leave, but she called out softly, "Wait." He paused. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For that day, for this, for all of it. I was wrong." Derek looked at her, not with anger, but with something deeper. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "You owe yourself understanding. Ask yourself why you were scared of someone who wasn't a threat. Because until you face that, this'll keep happening." Karen's eyes filled with tears she didn't quite understand. He walked back home, leaving her standing there, phone still in her hand, the weight of her own actions finally sinking in. That evening, she sat on her porch, staring across the street. Derek's house glowed warmly under the sunset, the sound of laughter spilling through the windows as his family gathered inside. For the first time, she saw him not as an intruder, not as an outsider, but as what he truly was, a man who had earned everything he had. Weeks passed. The awkwardness faded. One morning, Karen crossed the street again, this time without her phone, without suspicion. She knocked on Derek's door, holding a small basket of muffins. He opened it, surprised. "I know you don't owe me the time of day," she said softly, "but I wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything. You showed more grace than I deserved." He smiled faintly. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," she said. "Because people like me, we've been silent too long about what's wrong in our hearts. I'm trying to change that." He nodded. "That's a start." And from that day on, something subtle but real shifted on Cedar Lane. The neighbors talked more, listened more, looked past their fears more. Karen joined the local outreach program Derek ran. Slowly, she began to see the world differently, one act of humility at a time. Derek never bragged about what happened. He didn't post it online, didn't turn it into a headline. He just lived his truth, steady, dignified, unshaken. Because for him, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about showing that strength isn't in how loud you shout, but in how quietly you stand when the world tries to shrink you. And though Maplewood Heights would go on with its quiet mornings and trimmed lawns, everyone on Cedar Lane would remember that summer. The day a man taught an entire neighborhood what it really means to belong. The day a phone call meant to humiliate him instead revealed his power. The day a woman learned that prejudice has no home, not on that street, not in that heart, and not in that house. And from that day forward, when Derek sat on his porch and waved at the neighbors passing by, they didn't just see the delivery driver who once got questioned. They saw the homeowner who taught them grace.